This is an audio review of Chapter 20, Introduction to Sociology, Introduction to Population, Urbanization, and the Environment. So first we're starting with demography and population. Demography is the study of populations. So basically what they do is they try to understand the shape and the scope of the human population as it changes over time. So what they look at is fertility, mortality, and migration. Fertility rate is just basically how many kids are born, and mortality rate is how many people die. But migration is another factor in demography. How many people move into an area or move out of an area? Migration can take the form of immigration, which describes movement into a new area, or emigration, which refers to movement out of an area. So population growth is something that demographers study. Changing fertility, mortality, and migration rates make up the total population composition, which is a snapshot of the demographic profile of a population. And this number can be measured for societies, nations, world regions, or other groups. The population composition includes the sex ratio, or the number of men for every 100 women, as well as the population pyramid, which is a picture of the population distribution by sex and age. So, looking at the different demographic theories, first Malthusian theory says that 3 factors would control human population that exceeds Earth's carrying capacity, or how many people can live in a given area, considering the amount of available resources. So Malthus identified these factors as war, famine, and disease. And he called them positive checks because they increase mortality rates, which keeps the population in check. They're countered by preventative checks, which also control the population by reducing fertility rates, meaning having birth control or celibacy means there's less children born. Thinking practically, Malthus saw that people could produce only so much food in a given year, yet the population was increasing at an exponential rate. Eventually, he thought people would run out of food and begin to starve. They would then go to war over the scarce resources, and then the population would go down to something more manageable, and then the cycle would continue. Of course, that's not exactly what's happened. The human population has continued to grow long past Malthus's predictions. So what happened? We didn't die off. There's 3 reasons sociologists believe we're continuing to expand the population of the planet. First, technological increases in food production have increased both the amount and quality of calories that can be produced per person. Also, human ingenuity has developed new medicine to curtail death from disease. And then, of course, this is a huge one, especially considering the recent changes in the Supreme Court in the United States, the development and widespread use of contraception, right? So other forms of family planning, like condoms, birth control, things like this, have decreased the speed at which the population increases. But what about the future? Some still believe Malthus was correct and that resources will not be enough to support people, and that the population will basically go past the point at which the Earth's carrying capacity can continue to support them. So neo-Malthusians argue that the environment, not specifically the food supply, will play the critical role in the continued health of the planet's population. They suggest that the human population is moving towards complete environmental collapse as privileged people use up or pollute a number of environmental resources, like our air and our water. They advocate for zero population growth, in which the number of people entering the population through birth or immigration is equal to the number of people leaving through death or emigration. So, while support for this concept is mixed, it's still considered a possible solution to global overpopulation. So here's a fun one. For zero population growth, how many babies could you have with a partner and still have it be considered zero population growth? It's not 0, it's 2. The idea is that if you replace yourself and your partner, it's considered zero population growth because you'll die and they'll continue to live on in theory, right? But so even zero population growth arguments aren't saying, people should have no children. It's saying that people should only have a reasonable amount of children to replace themselves and not make the population grow exponentially. Meaning back in the day when Malthus was coming up with his argument, people were having 12 to 14 kids per family. And if all of those kids had 12 to 14 kids and their kids had 12 to 14 kids, that gets pretty big, that exponentially increases pretty quickly. Okay, moving on to cornucopian theory. So this argues that human ingenuity can resolve any environmental or social issues that develop. As an example, it points to the issue of the food supply. If we need more food, the theory says agricultural scientists will figure out how, right? And they've been doing this for centuries. After all, this perspective says that human ingenuity has been up to the task for thousands of years and that we're very adaptable. But the counterpoint I have to this is that technology already exists. to do these things, but it's the political will that is the problem. For instance, MIT and other prestigious schools will hold these kind of engineering competitions, and oftentimes these new renewable technologies that they develop are bought up by existing corporations so that they won't be used as a way to somehow take away from their profits. And then there's demographic transition theory. Whether you believe that we're headed for environmental disaster and the end of human existence as we know it, or you think people will adapt to changing circumstances, we can see clear patterns in population growth. Societies develop along a predictable continuum as they evolve from unindustrialized to post-industrial. So demographic transition theory suggests that future population growth will develop along a predictable four-stage model. In stage 1, birth, death, and infant mortality rates are all high, while life expectancy is short. An example of this stage is the 1800s in the United States. As countries begin to industrialize, they enter stage 2, where birth rates are high, while infant mortality and death rates drop. Life expectancy increases. Stage 3 occurs once a society is thoroughly industrialized, so birth rates decline where life expectancy continues to increase. Death rates continue to decrease. Mexico's population at this point is at this stage. In the final phase, stage 4, we see the post-industrial era of a society. Birth and death rates are low, people are healthier and live longer, and society enters a phase of population stability. Overall population may even decline. For example, Sweden is considered to be in stage 4. Moving on to changes in the U.S. immigration patterns and attitudes. Worldwide patterns of migration have changed. So the U.S., though, still remains a very popular destination for immigrants. From 1990 to 2013, the number of migrants living in the U.S. increased from 1 in 6 to 1 in 5. And while there are more foreign-born people residing in the U.S. legally, as of 2012, about 11.7 million people are here without legal status. Most citizens agree that our national immigration policies are in need of adjustment. Almost 3/4 of those in recent national surveys believed undocumented immigrants should have a path to citizenship, provided they meet other requirements, such as paying restitution or even understanding English, right? But across the political spectrum, most people agree that there should be some sort of path to amnesty for people who have lived here. Okay, moving on to urbanization. This is the study of the social, political, and economic relationships in cities, and someone specializing in urban sociology studies those relationships. In some ways, cities can be microcosms of universal human behavior, while in others, they provide a unique environment that yields its own brand of human behavior. So the growth of cities is based on access to resources like water, food, and strong social organization to manage cities. Today, the primary influence on cities' growth is economic forces, such as demand for jobs, or in times of recession, it's the impact of people seeking other places to work. So when looking at urbanization in the U.S., this proceeded rapidly during the industrial era. As more and more opportunities for work appeared in factories, workers left farms and rural communities to move to the cities. So you had, in just about a 40-year period of time, the majority of the population went from living in rural areas to living in urban city centers. So as cities grew more crowded and often more impoverished and costlier, more and more people began to migrate back out of them. But instead of returning to rural small towns, they needed close access to the city for their jobs. In the 1850s, as urban population expanded and transportation options improved, suburbs developed. So suburbs are the communities surrounding cities, typically close enough for a daily commute in, but far enough away to allow for more space than city living would afford. So suburban landscape used to be pastoral, right? Meaning kind of like filled with open green spaces. But as these things have developed since the early 20th century, they've really disappeared due to sprawl, or what we call suburban sprawl. This is this, need to continue to develop, even though there's already stuff everywhere. So as commuting times and distances have continued to increase, as new suburbs are developed farther and farther from city centers, they need more stuff in between. Suburban sprawl is kind of all those strip malls and centers and things, just the same crap over and over and over. Take every green space and pave it over. And so this dynamic has contributed to exponential increase in natural resource use, like petroleum, right? And of course, increase in pollution in the form of carbon emissions. And so as the suburbs became more crowded and lost their charm, Those who had more money could go to the exurbs. These are communities that exist on the outside ring of the suburbs, the wealthiest communities that have more space and, of course, the resources to pay for a lengthened commute. So together, the suburbs, exurbs, and metropolitan areas combined to form a metropolis. New York was the first U.S. megalopolis, a huge urban corridor encompassing multiple cities and their surrounding suburbs. So these metropolises use vast quantities of natural resources and are a growing part of the U.S. landscape. So we can't talk about suburbs and exurbs without really dealing with the issue of white flight. So in the United States, white flight refers to the migration of economically secure white people from racially mixed urban areas and towards the suburbs. So this is really important when it comes to understanding the issues of generational wealth. The fact that when suburbs were first created, they were whites only, even on the deeds of the properties, meant that people that were white were able to establish generational wealth in a way that was denied to people of color. Okay, so another issue of urbanization is gentrification, which occurs when members of the middle and upper class enter and renovate city areas that have been historically less affluent, while the poor urban underclass are forced by resulting price pressures to leave those neighborhoods for increasingly decaying portions of the city. So, San Francisco is a great example of this. It's so incredibly expensive now that even if you make six figures, it's difficult to find a place to live that's affordable. And what happens is gentrification can be positive in the way that, old buildings are knocked down to be replaced with better LEED certified buildings, or, the kind of influx of capital to an area can improve it in a lot of ways. But the real problem is that oftentimes gentrification is done in such a fashion as to push out the residents who actually lived there in an attempt to court wealthy white people from outside of the community. And this can even affect policing, like as we see in Echo Park, for example, where they enacted these gang ordinances that said you couldn't hang out with basically, three other people or you'd be considered a gang and you can be stopped, searched, frisked, all that kind of stuff. But who do we interpret to be a gang? Is it four white ladies going to get brunch? Is it the four white dudes in their jerseys going to the sports bar to watch the game? No, it's the four Latinx men, right? It's the men of color in those spaces that then are policed as if they don't belong in communities that literally have been historically living in, but now with the influx of white people and wealthy white people into these spaces, it kind of changes the whole dynamic of said neighborhoods. So sustainable development is the biggest global challenge for urbanized populations, particularly in less developed countries, right? We need to basically be able to build things, to have enough housing, to have enough for everyone of what we need without depleting or damaging the natural environment. So we can build, but we have to do it in a sustainable way, in an equitable way, in a way that doesn't disproportionately affect communities or marginalized groups, and especially doesn't impact negatively the environment and the local wild spaces that are often needed for things such as migrating birds and other animal populations. Human ecology is a functionalist field of study that looks at the relationship between people and the environment that they built and the natural physical environment. Generally speaking, urban land use and urban population distribution occur in a predictable pattern once we understand how people relate to their living environment. For example, in the U.S., we have a transportation system geared to accommodate people on freeways and cars, while in contrast, most parts of Europe emphasize public transportation, such as high-speed rail and commuter lines, as well as walking and bicycling. So in urban planning, they make accommodations for the space based on how it's going to be used. The challenge for human ecologists working in the U.S. is to design landscapes and waterscapes that have natural beauty, but also provide free-flowing transport for 1 million vehicles, right? Not to mention, parking for all of said vehicles. So that's kind of one of those things when you're trying to understand how can we then have better development, you have to think about how people use the space and why they do what they do. The concentric zone model is perhaps the most famous example of human ecology. The model views a city as a series of concentric circular areas expanding outward from the center to the edge. And the idea is that various zones are invading adjacent zones, kind of like an invasive species, right? Pushing out the inhabitants of said space. So in this model, the zone in the middle of the city is the center of business and culture. Zone B, around this zone, is where composed mostly of formerly wealthy homes that are now made into cheap apartments for either poor people or new immigrant populations. And this zone also has a lot of manufacturing. Zone C consists of the homes of the working class and established ethnic enclaves right outside of Zone B. Zone D, once you get a little bit further out, is the wealthy homes, the white-collar workers, and the shopping centers. And once you get to the far end, Zone E, you get to the estates of the upper class, those exurbs beyond the suburbs. Okay, and then NIMBY is in contrast to the functionalist approach. It's more about, looking at these things through more of a conflict perspective that focus on the way in which urban areas change according to the specific decisions made by political and economic leaders. These decisions generally benefit the middle and upper classes while exploiting the working and lower classes. For example, Fegan and Parker suggested 3 factors by which political and economic leaders control urban growth. First, these leaders work alongside each other to influence urban growth and decline, determining where money flows and how land is regulated. Second, exchange value and use of land are balanced in favor of the middle and upper classes. So, for example, public land in poor neighborhoods may be rezoned for use as industrial land, right? They're not going to put a dump in the wealthy community. Finally, urban development is dependent on both structure, meaning, the local government, and agency, meaning the people in those spaces as well, like the businessmen and activists. And these groups engage in a push-pull dynamic that determines where and how land is actually used. For example, this not in my backyard movement, or NIMBY movement, are more likely to emerge in middle to upper class neighborhoods as engaged citizens protest poor environmental practices they fear will affect them. So these groups have more control over the use of land. Environmental sociology studies the ways that humans interact with their environment. This field is closely related to human ecology, which focuses on the relationship between people and their built and natural environments. So this is an area that is garnering more attention as extreme weather patterns and policy battles over climate change start to dominate the news. A key factor of environmental sociology is the concept of carrying capacity, which describes the maximum amount of life that can be sustained within a given area. While the concept can refer to grazing lands or to rivers, we can also apply the concept of the carrying capacity to the earth as a whole. So the tragedy of the commons is the idea that when we overconsume or underinvest in shared resources, they're destroyed by overuse. A quick example is when there's a flower bloom and every jerk goes to take a picture of themselves and the flowers for Instagram, but they end up trampling all the flowers and destroying the beauty that they're trying to promote on their Instagram feed. Another example could be being stuck in traffic is no fun. The road system's made to effectively transport you to one place or another. I think about this every time a band I like is playing in LA. I think, how long is it going to take me to get there? Knowing that without traffic, it's a pretty quick trip. But with traffic, it can take a very long time. Not only does it take a long time, but all those cars are running and all the pollution from them are streaming into the air, making it a situation where about 2,200 people a year die prematurely from air pollution in our cities. Another example could be groundwater. It is subject to depletion if it's not effectively managed. In the U.S., agriculture uses 50 billion gallons of groundwater every day. Additionally, groundwater is a source of drinking water for half of the country's population. When individuals pump too much groundwater, the resource is depleted before it can be replenished, and the consequences are significant. Individual overuse of groundwater reduces the amount and quality of the water supply, helping create a problem that impacts everyone. As the water table lowers, wells are unable to reach their water sources, and the lakes and rivers and streams that are connected to the groundwater have less supply to pull from. Additionally, more energy and money are required for pumping groundwater to the surface. And along the coasts, excessive pumping ruins water quality by allowing salt water to contaminate the supply. In order to sustain our shared resources, individual actors have to communicate and collaborate rather than acting purely out of their own self-interest. The journey towards sustainable groundwater management in Southern California speaks to the magnitude of such an issue and the hard work required in ensuring that valuable resources are not destroyed. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures due to human activity, and in particular the the release of greenhouse gases into the environment. The planet as a whole is warming, but the term climate change acknowledges that the short-term variations in this process can include both higher and lower temperatures, despite the overarching trend towards warmth. Climate change is a deeply controversial subject despite decades of scientific research and a high scientific degree of consensus that supports its existence. One effect of climate change is more extreme weather. There are increasingly more record-breaking weather phenomena, from the number of Category 4 hurricanes to the amount of snowfall in a given winter. These extremes, while they make for dramatic television coverage, can cause immeasurable damage to crops, property, and lives. So why is there a controversy? The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, NOAA, recognizes the existence of climate change. So the 196 countries who signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement also agree. So what's the argument about? Well, for one thing, for companies making billions of dollars in the production of goods and services, the idea of costly regulations that would require expensive operational upgrades has been a source of great anxiety. They argue via lobbyists that such regulations would be disastrous for the economy. Some go so far to even question the science used as evidence. There's a lot of finger pointing among countries, especially when the issue arises of who is allowed to pollute. World systems analysis suggests that while historically core nations like the US and Western Europe were the greatest sources of greenhouse gases, they have now evolved into post-industrial societies. Industrialized, semi-peripheral, and peripheral nations are releasing an increasing amount of quantities of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide. The core nations, now post-industrial and less dependent on greenhouse gas-causing industries, now they want to enact strict protocols regarding the causes of global warming. But the semi-peripheral and peripheral nations rightly point out that they only want the same economic chances to evolve as these other economies did in other nations. Since they were unduly affected by the progress of core nations, if the core nations now insist on green policies, they should pay offsets or subsidies of some kind. So there's no easy answers to this conflict. It may well not be fair that the core nations benefited from the ignorance during their industrial boom, but there needs to be some sort of actionable change in order to sustain human life on the planet. So in your additional resources, there's a video about the Paris Climate Agreement, just to kind of briefly wrap, what it is and where it came from. And really the question becomes, why do we do nothing? There are a lot of very rich and powerful people who profit from things as they are today. So why would they want to change that to save all of humanity from a tipping point, which may make the planet uninhabitable for people and plants and animals? Why are the rich doing this? And what are the rich doing? It's telling, right? Like, look at the billionaires. What are they doing? They're trying to leave, to go to Mars. I mean, they're going to spend all their wealth to create their own privileged colony to be on when the rest of the world becomes ravaged by the effects of climate change. Longer hurricane seasons with stronger hurricanes. And what happens there is that they stay over land longer, which produces more damage and more flooding. Climate change also gives us more droughts, more wildfires, and more intense storms. We will all be affected, but some will be affected sooner, especially those living on islands that are only feet above sea level that will be swallowed whole as the ice caps melt and sea level rises. So why do we do nothing? Because it financially benefits us to do so. Not us personally, but those people in power that make these decisions. I don't know if you've seen the movie Don't Look Up. It's the best allegory for climate change I've ever seen. It shows how the media is trivial. It doesn't take climate change seriously. It shows how politicians just keep reviewing and assessing. It shows how we will do things that risk our annihilation if they make a lot of money for the most rich and the most powerful of us. And if you haven't seen the movie Don't Look Up, I highly recommend it. Okay, moving on to pollution as an environmental problem. Pollution describes what happens when contaminants are introduced into an environment, into the water, air, land, or other ecosystem, at levels that are damaging. Environments can often sustain a limited number of contaminants without marked change, and water, air, and soil can quote-unquote heal themselves to a certain degree. However, once contamination levels reach a certain point, the results can be catastrophic. Water pollution, for example, a child dies every 15 seconds because they don't have access to clean drinking water. Access to safe water is one of the most basic human needs, and it's woefully out of reach for millions of people on the planet. Many of the major diseases that peripheral countries battle, such as diarrhea, cholera, typhoid, are caused by contaminated water. Often young children are unable to go to school because they must instead walk several hours a day to collect potable water for their family. The situation is only getting worse as the global population increases, as water is a very key resource battleground for the 21st century. There's a finite amount of water usable by humans, and it's constantly used and reused in a sustainable water cycle. The way we use this abundant natural resource, however, renders much of it unsuitable for consumption and unable to sustain life. For instance, it takes 2.5 liters of water to produce a single liter of Coca-Cola. The company and its bottlers use close to 300 billion liters of water a year, often in places in the world that are short of usable water. As a consequence of population concentrations, water close to human settlements is frequently polluted with untreated or partially treated human waste, like sewage, or chemicals, radioactivity, and levels of heat sufficient to create what's called dead zones, areas that are incapable of supporting aquatic life. The methods of food production used by many core nations rely on liberal doses of nitrogen and pesticides, which end up back in the water supply. In some cases, water pollution affects the quality of the aquatic life consumed by water and land animals. As we move along the food chain, the pollutants travel from prey to predator. Since humans consume at all levels of the food chain, we ultimately consume the carcinogens such as mercury, accumulated through several branches of the food web. Protecting water often falls to marginalized communities, for instance, indigenous communities that are trying to protect water from industry who will destroy these resources. This issue came to a head at Standing Rock, where the company Enbridge wanted to build the Dakota Access Pipeline under a river with the risk of an oil spill into a pristine water supply. It was originally proposed close to the city, but was moved away into indigenous territory, and even when the construction was stopped due to an environmental impact survey, the construction continued, which is what you'll see in the film clip in your additional resources. So soil erosion and desertification are just two of the many forms of soil pollution. In addition, all the chemicals and pollutants that harm our water supply can also leach into the soil with similar effects. Brown zones where nothing can grow are common results of soil pollution. One demand the population boom makes on the planet is a requirement for more food to be produced. The so-called Green Revolution in the 1960s saw chemists and World Aid organizations working together to bring modern farming methods complete with pesticides to developing countries. The immediate result was positive. Food yields went up and burgeoning populations were fed. But as time has gone on, these areas have fallen into even more difficult straits as the damage done by modern methods leave traditional farmers with less than they had to start. So air is another issue of pollution. Remember that tragedy of the commons. Each of us is affected by air pollution. But like the herder who adds one more head of cattle to realize the benefits of owning more cows, one who does not have to pay the price of being overgrazed land, we take the benefit of driving or buying the latest cell phone without worrying about the end result. Air pollution accumulates in the body, much like the effects of smoking cigarettes accumulates over time, leading to more chronic illnesses. In addition to directly affecting human health, air pollution affects crop quality as well, and affects heating and cooling costs. In other words, we all pay a lot more than the price at the pump when we fill up our tank with gas. Okay, so garbage is another environmental problem. What happens to your phone when you get a new one? Where does all your trash go? How much trash do you make in a day? Most of us throw things away and never think about it again. The two primary means of waste disposal in the U.S. are landfills and incineration. When it comes to getting rid of dangerous toxins, neither one is a good choice. Styrofoam and plastics that many of us use every day do not dissolve in a natural way. If you burn them, they release carcinogens into the air. Their improper incineration, intentional or not, adds to air pollution and increases smog. If you dump them in a landfill, they don't decompose. As landfill sites fill up, we risk an increase in groundwater contamination. So landfills are actually some of the largest human-made structures in the world. we create trash mountains to hide the extent of our backwards, disposable society. Think of it this way. Think of the convenience of single-use plastics, right? Something that a lot of us use all the time. So think about that plastic spoon, right, that you might use instead of just a normal spoon. For that spoon to be convenient, someone had to drill oil out of the land, right? Refine that oil, drive it to a place or put it through a pipeline to where it could be refined, then basically transport that oil to a production facility where they will mold it into petrochemicals, plastics. And then from that place, they take those raw materials and take it to another factory that makes spoons out of plastics. Then they package that in more plastic and then put that on a truck and then send that to somewhere so that you can grab it and use it once for 5 minutes and throw it in the trash. And somehow that's more convenient than just like washing a spoon. When you really understand the long-term consequences of these things and the way that our choices have an impact on how much of this pollution and waste gets out of control, we realize that the convenience of single-use plastics is a lie. It's not convenient at all to do all these things, right? At every level of that process, there's pollution, there's consequences. But because of our kind of consumerist society that says just use it once and throw it away, we often don't even think twice about using single-use plastics. Another issue is e-waste. This is the name for obsolete, broken, and worn down electronics, from computers to mobile phones to TVs. The challenge is that these products, which are multiplying at alarming rates, thanks in part to planned obsolescence. So this is the idea that they design products to quickly become outdated and then be replaced by the constant emergence of newer and cheaper electronics. So in the companies themselves, they want to make more money. They don't want you to keep that TV for 25 years. They don't want you to keep that cell phone for a decade. So planned obsolescence means it goes out of date pretty quickly and then you need a new one. And again, most of us never think twice about what happens to this stuff when we get rid of it. Right? So the other thing too is that most people don't realize that a lot of our electronics have toxic chemicals and precious metals in them, which makes for a dangerous combination. So where do they go? Many companies ship their e-waste to developing nations in Africa and Asia to be quote unquote recycled. While they are in some sense recycled, the result is not clean. In fact, it's one of the dirtiest jobs around. Overseas, without the benefit of environmental regulations, e-waste dumps become a kind of boom town for entrepreneurs, willing to sort through endless stacks of broken down electronics for tiny bits of valuable copper, silver, and other precious metals. Unfortunately, in that hunt, these workers are exposed to deadly toxins. And then, of course, there's toxic and radioactive waste. Radioactivity is a form of air pollution. While nuclear energy promises a safe and abundant power source, increasingly it's looked upon as a danger to the environment and to those who inhabit it. We accumulate nuclear waste, which we must then keep track of long term and ultimately figure out how to store the toxic waste material without damaging the environment or putting future generations at risk. There's this great documentary called Fierce Green Fire that looks at the environmental movement over time, and they do this part on this community called Love Canal and their struggle to get rid of 20,000 tons of toxic waste that was buried beneath their community that then broke open. And the results were, kids being born, many of them just not being born at all, but the kids that were being born with like 3 ears, multiple rows of teeth, either mental or physical abnormalities. And it was the result of being exposed to that toxic radioactive waste. And, it took the residents of that area a lot of basically planning and strategic, organizing to be able to actually be relocated. But the consequences are forever. The children that were born in that area have genetic damage, meaning, any kids they have and any kids they have and so on for generations will all hold the genetic markers of damage because of the contamination from Love Canal. Okay, so environmental racism is another important issue to discuss. So I put a video in your additional resources from last week tonight that does cover some of the issues of environmental racism because, again, I know he throws a lot of F-bombs out there, but it does a good job of informing about the topic. So when looking at indigenous tribes and environmental racism, like we saw with the issues at Standing Rock, indigenous communities are often on the front lines of activism in protecting nature from industrial exploitation. The oil from Keystone XL and DAPL would not even go to Americans. The risks are so high, and the benefits only go to corporations. The residents are left to deal with the consequences. So why does this exist? Racism, classism, inequality. When you value some groups less in society, this guides policymaking and corporate decisions. As you'll see in that Last Week Tonight video, those corporate folks are so privileged that they will just say, well, people knew what they were getting into and they decided to live in that neighborhood, or tell them to move if it's a problem, which is obviously something a super wealthy person can do, but not poor people who often live in toxic communities, because that's the only place where housing is even almost affordable. So it's so gross and callous to say, just move. I'd say then help them move, pay for the move, give them a down payment. You're not willing to do that, but you're willing to make millions of dollars a year while polluting communities of color and leading to premature deaths of thousands of people. It's just too much. So a big issue is understanding how the social value system in society also overlaps and really is entangled with a lot of those, issues of pollution and environmental problems. So environmental racism and really this environmental justice movement took a lot of years for, because for some time civil rights groups didn't necessarily move towards this. And at the same time, environmental groups often ignored the influence or just the impacts, the disproportionate impacts of pollution and other issues on communities of color. So it took, almost a couple decades for those two coalitions to come together, for the environmental movement and the civil rights movement to come together and realize that, there needs to be more of an environmental justice movement to make sure that as we move forward with these, horrible industries, that we can protect the most marginal while also calling attention to the larger issues in the environment that need to be addressed.